You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 391, Washington's Scandals and Resignations. Now, George Washington made no secret of the fact that he really didn't want to be president. Other national leaders had to convince and cajole him into doing it, telling him that without his leadership, the Constitution would not survive, and without the Constitution, the United States would fall apart. Washington served for 4 years, expecting to get the new nation off to a good start, and then finally retire to his plantation in Virginia. Once again, though, national leaders begged him to remain for a second term. I think Washington really regretted his decision to remain for a second term. Some of the most controversial issues arose in that term, including the Citizen Genet affair, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Jay Treaty controversies. Also, by halfway through his second term, his cabinet members had all abandoned him. Resignations are normal in government. Postmaster General John Osgood had left during the first term. The Postmaster General was not really part of the cabinet at the time and didn't have any role in policy making aside from running the post office. Osgood, originally from Massachusetts, had been living in New York, working first under the Confederation Congress, then under President Washington. But when the capital moved from New York to Philadelphia in 1791, Osgood didn't want to move, and he resigned instead. Washington's second Postmaster General, Timothy Pickering, deserves a little more background because he does become more important in our story going forward. He had been Adjutant General and Quartermaster General of the Continental Army during the Revolution. Although Pickering was born and raised in Massachusetts, he moved to the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania after the war. There he got caught up in the Yankee-Pennamite Wars, which I discussed a bit in earlier episodes during the Revolutionary War. But this was an ongoing fight between the Yankees in Connecticut and the Pennsylvanians, who both claimed control over the Wyoming Valley. The Pennsylvania State Assembly appointed Pickering as an official in the newly formed Luzerne County, tasked with mediating conflicting claims between settlers. It was in this capacity that some Connecticut settlers kidnapped Pickering in 1788, trying to force him to recognize their land claims. Pickering refused to negotiate with his kidnappers and was dragged through the forest while Pennsylvania militia were trying to track them down. After nearly 3 weeks, his captors released him. Pickering spent the next few years taking time off from his farm to help negotiate some of the treaties with Indians regarding control of land in western Pennsylvania and the Ohio Territory. President Washington offered him several jobs, including quartermaster of the new army, but Pickering declined. He finally accepted the role of Postmaster General in 1791. There he would serve as postmaster for about 3.5 years before moving on to become Secretary of War, and we'll get into the reasons for that shortly. Joseph Habersham succeeded him in the role of Postmaster General and continued on in that role until the Jefferson administration. Habersham was from Georgia. He'd served as a colonel in the Continental Army, but resigned after serving as Lachlan McIntosh's second in the 1777 duel that killed Button Gwinnett, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. After the war, Habersham remained active in Georgia politics, where he served as Speaker of the Georgia House, and he was serving as mayor of Savannah when Washington appointed him as Postmaster General. The first actual cabinet member to resign was the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. When Washington appointed Jefferson, the two men seemed to get along pretty well. As Washington's first term came to an end, Jefferson was among those who begged Washington to accept a second term. Washington, in turn, asked that Jefferson stay on as Secretary of State. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton regularly found themselves on opposite sides of many issues. The Bank of the United States was a big one, but what really divided the two men was foreign policy. Hamilton wanted a good economic relationship with Britain, while Jefferson wanted closer ties to France. Washington's plan to form a consensus from these divergent views was to begin having cabinet meetings where they could all sit around a table together, hash out their differences, and reach an agreeable solution. Jefferson hated these meetings. He referred to his conflicts with Hamilton there as being, quote, daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. This was a reference to cockfighting, which was a popular pastime where gamblers would throw two chickens into an arena known as a cockpit, and the two animals would try to peck each other to death. Jefferson came to believe that Hamilton had a growing influence over Washington, who seemed to be siding more and more with the policies that favored Britain abroad and rich bankers and investors domestically. To counter this, Jefferson began subsidizing Philip Freneau, who published the National Gazette, which regularly attacked Washington. The paper at one point published a cartoon showing Washington being sent to the guillotine. Washington lost his temper and railed against the paper that Jefferson continued to support. Now, finally, at the end of 1793, less than a year into Washington's second term, Jefferson had had enough, and he submitted his resignation. Even at that point, though, Washington said he accepted it with regret and was sorry to see him go, but he did feel deserted by Jefferson. After returning to private life, Jefferson continued to attack Washington as becoming too senile and becoming the puppet of Hamilton and the Federalists. In 1796, Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend where he referred to former Revolutionary heroes as apostates who had been, quote, shorn by the harlot England. This letter eventually became public, and Washington took personal offense at the claim. He wrote Jefferson a letter that bluntly expressed his offense, and the two men ceased all communication. They would never reconcile. Attorney General Edmund Randolph took over as Secretary of State following Jefferson's departure. Randolph resigned as Secretary of State about a year and a half later for reasons that we'll get into in a moment. Timothy Pickering completed the remainder of Washington's term as Secretary of State. So Pickering was moving from being the second Postmaster General to the second Secretary of War, and then became the third Secretary of State. The next secretary to depart was Henry Knox. During the Revolutionary War, the 25-year-old bookseller became one of General Washington's most reliable general officers. After the war, Knox moved into a capacity serving in charge of the Army under the Confederation Congress. Washington happily asked Knox to continue in that role when he became president. Washington tended to regard most of his cabinet secretaries as advisors. His relationship with Knox was a little different. Perhaps it was because Washington felt most knowledgeable personally in military matters. He tended to treat Knox more like a staff assistant than an advisor. He would give Knox instructions rather than ask his opinion on many matters of military policy. At the same time, though, Knox held Washington's trust and confidence. Hamilton once remarked near the beginning of President Washington's first term that Washington spoke with Knox the way a man does with his wife. Knox generally aligned himself with Hamilton as a Federalist and seemed to have a solid relationship with the president. That relationship, however, fell apart in 1794, and the incident that caused the rift came during the Whiskey Rebellion. After the Revolution had ended, Knox lived pretty extravagantly. He rented a downtown mansion in Philadelphia where he lived with Lucy and the children. Lucy enjoyed gambling and loved to play cards with Philadelphia's elite. The salary of a government bureaucrat simply didn't support that lifestyle, so Knox engaged in land speculation to supplement his wealth. Knox borrowed heavily to make investments in the Ohio Company. He also partnered with William Duer to purchase 2 million acres of land in Maine. During this time, Knox built a 19-room mansion in Thomaston, Maine, which he named Montpelier. I mentioned Duer back in episode 379, when his speculation led to the financial panic of 1792 and Duer's personal bankruptcy. Knox was hit hard by those events and was struggling and on the edge of bankruptcy himself. By the summer of 1794, Knox's financial situation had reached a crisis point. Knox had to request 6 weeks' leave from his position as Secretary of War so that he could travel to Maine and settle some of the financial problems related to his property there. The timing couldn't have been worse. This was the height of the Whiskey Rebellion, and just around the time that Washington issued his call to raise a militia army to crush that rebellion. This was one of the most critical times for the Secretary of War. Washington reluctantly approved the leave, but he was not happy about it. When Knox ended up being gone not for 6 weeks, but in fact more than 2 months, Washington grew even angrier. Hamilton happily filled in for Knox, accompanying Washington to western Pennsylvania, But while he was going to war, the president wanted his Secretary of War by his side, not his Treasury Secretary. When Knox returned to Philadelphia in October, he sent a note to Washington, who was still out in the field with the Army, about whether he wanted Knox to join him. Washington sent back a curt response, essentially saying it was too late for him to be useful, and Washington was already on his way back to Philadelphia by this time. 2 months later, at the end of December, Knox submitted his resignation. Knox cited financial reasons for his resignation. Washington, though still annoyed by Knox's absence during the Whiskey Rebellion, accepted the resignation in a way which witnesses called frosty and overly formal. Knox returned to Maine, where he sold much of his lands to stay out of debtor's prison. He eventually resolved his personal finances, but his public life was at an end. Despite Washington's coolness toward Knox toward the end of his term, the two men did remain close friends and continued to correspond with each other until Washington's passing. Timothy Pickering replaced Knox as Secretary of War, but served in that role for less than a year before moving on to Secretary of State in 1796. James McHenry replaced Pickering at the War Department. McHenry was a surgeon from Maryland. He'd served as a Continental officer during the Revolution, and after the war he served in the Maryland Senate and as a delegate to the Continental Congress. McHenry would remain in that position for the remainder of Washington's term and well into Adams' term. The Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, also left for money reasons. Hamilton had been the youngest member of the cabinet and arguably the most impactful on the new government. He had served as an aide to Washington for most of the Revolutionary War. Washington had come to admire and respect his abilities, especially in matters of finance. During his tenure as Treasury Secretary, Hamilton had become the de facto leader of the Federalist Party and also a lightning rod for abuse from the Democratic Republicans. The main cause of criticism was that Hamilton was imposing a British-style economy where much of the nation's wealth went to speculators and financiers who didn't really work for a living. Opponents believed that this would eventually result in a form of aristocracy, similar to the system in Britain, which they hated. At the beginning of Washington's second term, William Branch Giles, a congressman from Virginia, introduced a resolution to investigate Hamilton. Giles was also a young man, only 27 years old when he first was elected to Congress. Giles was the first representative to win in a special election in 1790, replacing Theodore Bland, who had died in office. Giles quickly aligned himself with the Jefferson-Madison faction in Congress. This faction not only opposed many of Hamilton's economic plans, they also suspected that there was an element of corruption. Hamilton might be enriching himself or his friends in these transactions at the expense of the Treasury. At the end of December 1792, Congress demanded a full accounting of some loans that Hamilton had taken in order to repay other loans that had a higher interest rate. Hamilton submitted a report to Congress a week later, on January 3, 1793, explaining the transactions. That was not good enough for Giles. A few weeks later, he introduced a series of resolutions demanding many more details, including the names of people who profited from the transactions. These resolutions essentially accused Hamilton of financial misconduct. Specifically, private investors in the Bank of the United States would benefit from these transactions. The resolutions also censored Hamilton's behavior and attacked his honesty. Giles didn't come up with these resolutions on his own. Jefferson had worked secretly with Giles in developing the resolutions. At this time, Jefferson was still a member of Washington's cabinet. Jefferson was open about his opposition. He spoke with President Washington about his concerns that Hamilton was hiding financial problems with the bank with these transactions, but he kept his cooperation with Giles a secret. In the end, Congress refused to pass the resolutions. The attacks on Hamilton were unfounded. Jefferson probably knew this from the beginning, but figured that some mud from the discussion would still stick to Hamilton, even if he was ultimately exonerated. Hamilton would remain Secretary of the Treasury for several more years, but like Henry Knox, Hamilton's lifestyle was not possible on his salary as a member of the cabinet. When Hamilton finally resigned on January 31, 1795, he was nearly broke. He returned to private practice as an attorney in New York in order to rebuild his wealth. Following Hamilton's departure, Oliver Wolcott took over at Treasury. Wolcott was from Connecticut. He had begun working with the Treasury Department under Hamilton as soon as it was formed. He'd first worked as an auditor, then as comptroller. When he replaced Hamilton as secretary, little changed. Wolcott greatly admired Hamilton and even kept up a vigorous correspondence with Hamilton after Hamilton returned to New York. Hamilton's critics complained that Hamilton was essentially still running the Treasury Department and influencing President Washington, just using Wolcott as a conduit for his policies and ideas. So, Attorney General Edmund Randolph was the last of the original cabinet members and ended up being the last to go. He had served as the president's legal advisor for years, even before he became president. Unlike other members of the cabinet, he was also able to take on private legal clients to supplement his government salary. We saw that last week when Hamilton represented Chisholm in the case of Chisholm v. Georgia that led to the adoption of the 11th Amendment. After Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State, Randolph moved over to state. William Bradford took over as Attorney General. Bradford was from Philadelphia. He'd served as Attorney General of Pennsylvania and on the state Supreme Court before joining the administration. Bradford seemed to be a man with a great legal future ahead of him. He was still in his late 30s while serving as Attorney General. Sadly, he became ill and died during the summer of 1795. Charles Lee then took over as Attorney General. This is not the General Charles Lee from the Revolutionary War. This Charles Lee was the younger brother of Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. He was a capable attorney who had some experience in the Virginia legislature, but I suspect he landed this role because he was part of the powerful Lee family, and that had to have contributed to Washington's decision to appoint him. But I want to get back to Edmund Randolph. His final departure as Secretary of State came under a cloud of scandal involving French Minister Jean-Antoine Fauchet. Now, you may recall that France had sent Fauchet in late 1793 to clean up the mess created by Citizen Genet that had pretty much destroyed relations between France and the U.S. During Fauchet's first year in America, the Whiskey Rebellion took center stage. That same year, John Jay was in London negotiating a treaty with Britain that French officials worried would destroy the Franco-American alliance. Fauchet tried to build relationships with top U.S. officials, including Edmund Randolph. In late October, Fauchet sent a secret dispatch, known as Dispatch No. 10, to officials in Paris. His report attacks the Washington administration on a number of issues. It describes the administration as decrepit. It mentions Randolph as a confidant and reports Randolph's concerns that Federalist policies, supported by Washington, are giving rise to what he calls a financiering class that wants to restore monarchy in America and enslave American trade to England. Fauchet also reports that Randolph suggests that for a few $1,000s, he can influence the outcome of the Whiskey Rebellion in a way that would benefit France. The dispatch is a cynical analysis of American politics and suggests that a few bribes could influence government policy, and it says explicitly that all of these patriots have their price. Fauchet put this dispatch onto a ship headed to Paris. A British warship, however, intercepted it and sent the letter to London. Officials there forwarded the dispatch to British Ambassador George Hammond in Philadelphia. In late July, Hammond shared the document with Treasury Secretary Wolcott, who in turn shared it with Secretary of War Pickering. At the time, Washington was home at Mount Vernon. Pickering and Wolcott viewed the dispatch as evidence that Randolph had asked the French ambassador for a bribe. They also saw it as committing treason by undercutting American policy in favor of France. All of these events are unfolding in the period just after the Senate had ratified the Jay Treaty, and the public was just learning about the treaty's terms. President Washington is debating whether to sign it. Washington returns to Philadelphia to deal with the matter. After reading the dispatch and discussing it with Wolcott and Pickering, the president decides that Randolph is essentially a French agent. At the time, Randolph was the only cabinet member opposing the Jay Treaty, which is something a French agent would do. After Washington returned to Philadelphia in August, he decided to end the dithering and just sign the Jay Treaty right away before the scandal over Randolph broke publicly. He ordered Randolph to inform Minister Hammond and send a signed copy of the treaty to London. Once that was done, Washington called Randolph into his office. There, with Walcott and Pickering present, Washington showed the dispatch to Randolph and demanded an answer. Randolph read the document as best he could. It was in French. After a short discussion, Randolph asked to leave the room while Washington discussed the matter with the others. When Randolph returned, Washington demanded a written explanation of the allegations in the dispatch. Since these involved some matters that took place more than a year ago, Randolph said he wanted to consult with other records before writing his version of events. Randolph believed that Washington was convinced he was guilty of something, maybe treason, maybe just disloyalty, but it was clear that the president did not believe there was an innocent explanation for the allegations made in the dispatch. Instead of writing an explanation, Randolph returned home and drafted his letter of resignation. Randolph's departure marked the last of the men who made up Washington's original cabinet. Next week, the U.S. signs a treaty with Spain that redraws the borders in the southern U.S. and also gives Americans access to the Mississippi River for the first time. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Chasen Harrison and Ron Thorson. I also want to welcome Randall Driver, who joined as a standard bearer this month. I've mentioned before that all my supporters at the Patreon level of $10 or higher get a magnet each month. So far this year, I've been sending out 2 magnets at a time every other month, and that's also going to be the case for May and June. It's just been easier for me to send them this way. It saves me time and postage. If anyone feels strongly about not getting their magnets every single month, please let me know. I also want to thank Junie Volkanen for a generous one-time gift on PayPal, and John Levinick and John Collins for one-time gifts via Venmo. I also wanted to let people know that I'm debating holding a meetup in Philadelphia on July 4th to celebrate the 250th. If you're going to be in town and you're interested, let me know. If there's some interest, I will send out more details for everyone. Before we get into this week's discussion, I have one quick correction. In last week's Q&A, I said that General Horatio Gates had received a mortal wound and died at Camden. Of course, I was thinking of the General Baron de Kalb. Gates wasn't even on the battlefield. Sorry for that slip-up, and thanks to Richard Kane for catching that slip and letting me know. This week, we covered all of President Washington's cabinet resignations, which took place over a 2-year period. In at least 3 of the 4 resignations of the initial cabinet members, money was an important factor. Only Jefferson, who, like the president, had a plantation to support him, left for reasons other than money problems. Only Randolph's departure was particularly scandalous. The Fawcett affair would make Randolph a political pariah. Now, Randolph might have weathered the criticism, except for his efforts to vindicate himself. Immediately after his resignation, Randolph dashed up to Newport, Rhode Island, where Fawcett was waiting to return to France. Randolph confronted Fawcett about the dispatch and asked him to write a certificate exonerating Randolph of any wrongdoing. Fawcett promised to do so, but when his ship needed to leave suddenly, he just boarded and left. A desperate Randolph sent another ship after Fawcett's ship, trying to catch up with it, but the ship failed to do so. Now, eventually, Fawcett sent a response to Randolph once he got back to France. So it wasn't until 5 months after his resignation, in December of 1795, that Randolph used Fawcett's response as the basis for a 100-page pamphlet that he published called A Vindication of Edmund Randolph, which included evidence that he believed disproved the allegations that had led to his resignation. If anything, though, the publication did more harm than good. In it, Randolph attacked President Washington, accusing him of hypocrisy and the, quote, injustice of an assassin, because of the way Washington turned on him. He also accused Washington of decidedly siding with the Federalists in favor of a British alliance. The publication made public a great many private and confidential cabinet deliberations as well. President Washington, of course, took great offense at the attacks on his character. He was also outraged that Randolph would betray the confidence of private discussions, which damaged the public trust. When Washington first received the pamphlet, he threw it on the floor out of disgust. He never spoke with Randolph again for the rest of his life. Now, even people who agreed politically with Randolph's policy recommendations and criticism of the administration were not impressed by his vindication. James Madison commented that Randolph had, quote, convicted himself of indiscretion and ineptitude. Jefferson was happy to see that Randolph agreed that the administration was headed in the wrong direction, but noted that Randolph's effort to pursue a middle path while in office, rather than picking a side, proved to be his ultimate failure. After writing Vindication, Randolph discovered what so many other men had discovered before him. When you attack Washington and try to make people choose between your honor and Washington's, they're going to go with Washington every time. Randolph would never again hold any public office. The only thing of significance he did after leaving office was representing Aaron Burr in his treason trial, something which certainly did not help his place with the public confidence. Washington, of course, had other problems. He tried to get some really top names to replace some of his cabinet members. He reached out to people like Patrick Henry, who might have been a good voice for the Democratic Republicans, but all of the folks that he contacted refused to join the cabinet. Instead, Washington finished his term with all hardcore Federalists, none of whom he had a relationship with before his presidency. Washington had also relied on James Madison for regular advice. Madison was a congressman, not part of the cabinet, but Washington relied on him for all sorts of things. After Washington signed the Jay Treaty, the two men stopped speaking. Madison had routinely had dinner with the president in his first administration. This stopped entirely, and the only written messages that they exchanged in the final years were very brief and formal notes. Madison did stay in the government as long as Washington did, but even Madison retired and went home, like Washington, after the 1796 elections. As with Jefferson, Washington never communicated with Madison again after he left office. I also didn't get into another big scandal that was brewing at this time, known as the Maria Reynolds affair. This was America's first political sex scandal, and it involved Alexander Hamilton. I avoided discussion of it here because the scandal did not become public until several years after Hamilton left office. So I'll probably devote an episode to this scandal in the future. At the time Hamilton left office, though, the affair was known only by a few top officials who had agreed to keep it from going public. My book recommendation this week is Edmund Randolph, a Biography by John Reardon. This, as you might guess, covers Randolph's life, including his work as governor of Virginia and as a member of the cabinet. It gives some good coverage of the Faucett scandal that ultimately ended Randolph's political career. This is an older book, first published in 1975. Reardon was a history professor at Loyola University. He also wrote a biography about Peyton Randolph. But if you are interested in reading more about Edmund Randolph, get Edmund Randolph, a Biography by John Reardon. My online recommendation is A Vindication of Edmund Randolph. This is the actual essay that Randolph wrote to explain the Faucett scandal and to justify his behavior. Although obviously biased and written to vindicate himself, it is a great primary source on this topic. It's available on archive.org, and as always, I've included a direct link to it on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, did George Washington have any descendants through his stepchildren? Well, the answer is yes. When George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, she had 2 children from her previous marriage. Washington raised the 2 young children as his own. His daughter Patsy died unmarried at age 17 from an epileptic seizure. His son, known as Jackie, did get married before he died at age 26 from an illness contracted during the Yorktown campaign. He married very young, though, and was very active in his marriage. He was 18 when he married 15-year-old Eleanor Calvert. In the 6 years of marriage before he died, the couple had 7 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Jackie's oldest daughter, Elizabeth Parke Custis, also known as Eliza, married Thomas Law, a wealthy British man who had moved to Washington, D.C. to get involved in land investments. That couple had only one daughter, who married Nicholas Lloyd Rogers, and they had 3 children. Eliza and Thomas Law actually separated relatively soon after their marriage and eventually got divorced. A second daughter of Jackie's was Martha, whose nickname was Patsy. She married Thomas Peter. They lived in Washington, D.C., where they had 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. A third daughter, Eleanor Park Custis, or known as Nellie, married Lawrence Lewis of Fredericksburg, Virginia. That couple also had 8 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Jackie had only one legitimate son who survived to adulthood, and that son, George Washington Park Custis, married Mary Lee Fitzhugh and built an estate in Arlington, Virginia. That couple had 4 children, only one of whom survived to adulthood, and that surviving daughter, Mary Ann Randolph Custis, married Robert E. Lee, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee and the eventual commander of the Army of Northern Virginia under the Confederacy. Now, there's also some evidence that Jackie Washington fathered an 8th child with a family slave named Anne Dandridge Costin. Anne was actually believed to be the daughter of John Dandridge, making her the half-sister of Martha Washington. Jackie and Anne's son, William Costin, was of course born into slavery, but he was emancipated as a young adult, and he married Delphi Judge, a former slave of Martha Washington's, who had been given as a wedding gift to Eliza Park Custis, his half-sister. Costin moved to D.C., where he started the first school for black children, as well as the Israel Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. As I said, Costin was a free man as an adult. He helped purchase the freedom of several of his family members, including 7 of his sisters, with the help of Thomas Law, who was his half-sister Eliza's husband. Law also manumitted his wife, Delphi, and her children. Costin and Delphi had a large family together, although the details are not well recorded, although one of his daughters, Louisa Park Costin, took over the D.C. school that he had created. Today, through Jackie Custis, Washington has descendants that probably number in the thousands. None carry the Custis surname, however, since his only son had an only daughter who survived to adulthood. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.